Why would a god do that? Why would he send his own son to suffer for the sins of ordinary people?
Because he loves us. God made himself approachable to us, human, so we could understand him. We can't understand God in all his perfection, but we can understand God's Son and his suffering as we would a brother's.
That made no sense. Sacrificing the innocent to atone for the sins of the guilty. What kind of love is that?
That's a quote from The Life of Pi. I'm trying to mention more about our sound clips, since listeners have asked for this. Moreover, it tells us that on this February, the year of our demiurge 2018, we shall be dealing with the Logos and Christianity, specifically with the Gnostic origins of Christianity. We'll be joined by not one, but two august astral guests. So lock up your daughters of conformity and unlock your chastity belts of traditionalism, because heresy shouldn't be this much fun. Prepare to have your mind expanded and reality disbanded, for you have arrived at Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West.
You are not in Kansas anymore. If there is a hell, you might want to go there for some R&R.
Welcome, you spiritual entrepreneurs and modern-day Tom Sawyers, your mind not for rent by any god or government. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything, including finding the mystery that works for you and only you. Unleash your full imagination so that you may create better than the creator gods and their butt slaves in the establishment. When hope dies, as it is in this world, imagination must live, because that is the true Messiah. That is the key to the doorways of perception and the shaft into the realm of archetypes, symbols, and forgotten energies that bring meaning to a cold, mechanistic universe. Like Henry Miller wrote, "The aim of life is to live, and to live means to be aware, joyously, drunkenly, serenely, divinely aware."
My father says that almost the whole world is asleep. Everybody you know, everybody you see, everybody you talk to. He says that only a few people are awake, and they live in a state of constant, total amazement.
And I, your host Miguel Connor, also known as that Pompidus of Gnosis Abraxas, continues to contend that the Gnostic stance is the best spiritual/mental tech to navigate the desert of the real and break out from this Black Mirror Season 4 USS Callister reality.
Yes, it's a bubble universe ruled by an asshole god.
No surprise for me, but I'm not alone, as other exemplars of the counterculture like Gordon White and Chris Knowles agree. And so does Eric Davis, one of today's chief journalists on Western esoterica and a main force behind bringing out Philip K. Dick's The Exegesis to the public. As Eric wrote, Gnostic lore also provides a mythic key for the kind of infomania and conspiratorial thinking that comes to haunt the post-war world, with its terror of nefarious cabals, narcotic technologies, and invisible messengers of deception.
Inside the Matrix, they are everyone, and they are no one.
What else can I say? I say, like some Abraxas foghorn. And of course, the Gnostic impulse is to keep looking at the past as you look beyond the ruling stars. In his latest book, Soul Story, Tim Freak also declares that the past is where so much treasure, and dragons, is found to that knighting force of self-knowledge. Don't listen to New Age and nihilist secularist palaver on there is no past. There is a past, and it's always changing, as new revelation and overlooked insights can be found there. And the healing of personal and cosmic trauma.
Careful, Chief. You dig up the past, all you get is dirty.
It's only after we've lost everything that we're free to do anything.
Thus we continue with the origins of Christianity to heal so much trauma, and as mentioned, to find out how Gnostic they are. And what is the nature of Jesus, the Logos or reason of the divine, even if he's so complex as the ultimate trickster god along with Sophia. For this vital Valis quest, we truly have the aeonic pleasure of having with us Tim Claason, the fantastic mind behind the remarkable blog I enjoy, Tim's Stepping Out. Tim's scholarship on Gnosticism and ancient Christianity is dizzying, and his eyes find what many academics seem to miss, or just won't face.
You know much that is hidden, though, Tim. Quite.
Certainly check out the blog, timsteppingout.wordpress.com. Tim is a deep thinker and an all-around great guy. Glad to have him at the virtual Alexandria. And certainly so glad that none other than Alex Rivera joined us in the interview. An individual who I look up to because he knows far more about Gnosticism and Western esoterica than I do. Beyond a lucid thinker, Alex is also a great guy. And he's the author of Baphomet, the Temple Mystery Unveiled, which he co-wrote with the Sophianic Tracy Twyman. And he's the author of the novel Crimson Dusk. Alex is also the force behind the very red-pilling Megas AM podcast. For more on Alex, please visit theaeoni.com. Of course, check out our show notes for both links to Alex and Tim.
We are to extricate the truth from this unbeliever on pain of torture.
And with Vance the Moondog joining us, it was a quaternary of high heretics and concentrated gnosis on the various forces that brought about Christianity, including the mysterious Nazarenes, the Queen of Heaven cult, Cerinthus, the Ebionites, Basilides, Valentinus, the Book of Revelation, and plenty of Simon Magus and Helen of Tyre. We cover all of this and so much more in an epic interview. And for members, we'll continue this discussion in our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group. So visit us if you can. Thanks for those of you who make this happen. Help keep this Red Pill cafeteria open. I can't do it without you. I simply can't.
You're like this island unto yourself.
I can't enjoy anything unless everybody is. If one guy is starving someplace, that's, I puts a crimp in my evening.
Yes, the past is essential for wholeness and the knowledge of the heart. As the Gospel of Thomas says, the disciple said to Jesus, "Tell us, how will our end come?" Jesus said, "Have you found the beginning, then, that you are looking for the end? You see, the end will be where the beginning is." Or as Pinocchio said, "Go to the beginning to get to the end. Find out what is real to know the pretend."
In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
The Gnostics were obsessed with the past because, like the Joker in Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, the past is multiple choice, a string of infinite interpretations and possibilities. And nothing got the Gnostics hard more than the concept of infinity.
I didn't come here to tell you how this is going to end. I came here to tell you how it's going to begin.
Let us end with the quote of another brilliant mind that exemplifies all that I've said and all you're about to hear. That continues to tell us the Gnostic path is the best way to deal with the past and the future beyond the ruling stars, to keep thriving in this insane present. And that is a quote by past guest Steve D., who wrote in The Craft of Chaos, "The Gnostic impulse almost certainly predates its predominantly Christocentric expression and reflects an understanding of humanity's struggle with belief, meaning in our experience of suffering. If you try reading the primary sources of classical Gnosticism, the Sethians, the Valentinians, etc., you can't but be both impressed and frankly bewildered by the way they engage with myth, symbol, and the goal of personal liberation. The Gnostics viewed their spiritual heroes less as figures that needed to be believed in, and more as exemplars of a heightened consciousness that we should all seek to aspire to. These were gods that I actually liked, rather than being required to, quote, love. But enough of my drivel. Let us to the interview with Tim Claason and Alex Rivera. The first part for all audiences, while members and patrons get the full dope. You are truly amazing. You are truly beautiful. But why are you wearing that stupid man suit?
Do you believe in time travel?
I was never crucified. I never came back from the dead. I'm a man like everybody else.
Quiet.
Who are you talking about? Don't try and tell me what happened to me, because I know.
Their only hope is the resurrected Jesus. I don't care whether you're Jesus or not. The resurrected Jesus will save the world, and that's what matters.
Those are lies. You can't save the world by lying.
I created the truth out of what people needed and what they believed. If I have to crucify you to save the world, then I'll crucify you. And if I have to resurrect you, then I'll do that too, whether you like it or not.
I won't let you. I'll tell everyone the truth.
Who's going to believe you? You started all this, now you can't stop it. All those people who believe me will grab you and kill you.
No, that wouldn't happen.
How do you know? You see, you don't know how much people need God. You don't know how happy He can make them. He can make them happy to do anything. Make them happy to die. And they'll die. All for the sake of Christ. Jesus Christ. Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, the Messiah. My Jesus is much more important and much more powerful.
This is the AM Bite interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of having Tim Claason, the amazing mind behind the blog Tim Stepping Out, which I really enjoy. How are you doing today, Tim?
I'm great. How are you, Miguel?
I'm doing great. And with us, we've got the Moondog Vance. How are you doing today, Vance?
Oh, I'm fine, and I'm looking forward to this.
Yes, definitely. So, Tim, I'd like to start in the beginning. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to start your fascinating blog, Tim Stepping Out.
Well, I grew up in a really pretty moderate household, politically and religiously. I kind of think of my parents as Reagan Democrats, although I don't. I've never really asked them if that was sort of their ideology, but we had a household that was very pragmatic, very practical. We attended a Protestant church maybe a dozen times a year. We would go several weeks in a row and then skip, and we weren't
Right.
we weren't really tied to any specific dogma or anything like that. We were pretty run-of-the-mill Protestants. And I moved to Wisconsin. I was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I moved to Wisconsin when I was around 10. And I was suddenly thrown into a pool of Catholics, and it put me into sort of a sense of being a minority. I wasn't traumatized or anything like that, but I definitely felt just a little bit different than what was the majority of my classmates at the time, and I had never really met any Catholics or really anyone outside of my own background at the time, really, in terms of religion. It seemed to me that most of the people in my life were likewise Protestant Lutherans. But it wasn't really a traumatic situation or anything like that. It was just religion was sort of just a thing that was there. But throughout my 20s and into my 30s, I started becoming increasingly detached from religion. I was about 21 or so when 9/11 hit, and it seemed to me that increased religion correlated to increased bad things happening. That was sort of my sentiment around the time. And as I got older, I got sort of increasingly detached from what seemed like a really anti-scientific dogmatism, which in various parts of the country is trying to inject itself into schools and things like that. And it just didn't. As sort of a technically minded person, I just sort of that just didn't appeal to me very much. And at the time, I think we were starting to see a resurgence of mega church preachers and things like that who were being enriched by their congregants' generosity. And I think that it sort of just led into just a real sort of alienation in terms of how I felt about religion. But about 3 years ago, I kind of arrived to a point where I just said I don't really want to be a part of this anymore. I think that I can come to derive a moral and ethical compass on my own. I don't really need religion or anything like that to tell me what seems like common sense. And so I started this sort of opened up a pretty big avalanche of intellectual inquiry. And I decided I'd chronicle it, going through just trying to decipher what it is I believe and why it is I believe it. And along the way, despite an impulse to sort of not explore it, I stumbled onto this question, which is, I think, increasingly being asked is, did Jesus Christ exist at all? And my impulse at the time was to just leave it alone because I'd rather not go against any academic consensus if I can avoid it. I really appreciate what academics do. I don't really consider myself an academic. I'm just about to get my master's degree here, but I don't really consider myself an academic the way real academia is done. But I also felt like I couldn't ignore some of the things that were going on in this debate, specifically surrounding the silence around Jesus Christ and things like that. And I stumbled upon, after sort of kind of going back and forth about whether or not I really cared to investigate the topic, I sort of decided I would sort of dip my toes into the thing and see what I could find, if there was anything to find. And so I started investigating primary sources, notably some of the early Christian fathers who were writing really with a lot of tenacity against a lot of these so-called heretical sects. They wrote hundreds of thousands of words outlining specifically what is wrong with these groups. And it wasn't the fact that they really were writing about these groups, it's that they were so persistent about writing about them, and that they felt so inclined to write so much. It got me to wonder whether the early Catholic Church was really the majority, or if these heretics about whom they were writing were the majority. And so that sort of opened up another line of inquiry, and I started investigating some of these early church fathers and what they had to say about some of these groups, and I found it to be interesting enough that I that I kept going with it for about 2 years here.
Wow! And so you just started blogging about it, just to share the insights you found and so forth.
Yeah, I had during during sort of the first phase of my blog, just sort of collecting ideas about how what my sort of epistemological foundation is. I'd collected some followers who were interested in what I had to say, and I felt like I was saying things that were really not very well explored, even among people who who don't necessarily believe Jesus Christ existed. They weren't. A lot of them weren't terribly familiar with some of these early church fathers, and so the comment threads and stuff that would pop up after I would post something were so interesting, and they rose more questions in my mind. So I decided to just sort of keep going on it, and you eventually get to the point when you've developed a basis of understanding who these people were and what they believed, that you sort of get to understand the picture of the world, or at least the theology that they were advocating. So,
with us too, just joining us, we have Alex Rivera, who is also an excellent scholar in alternative Christianity and origins of Christianity, author of Baphomet, and he's going to be joining us too. How are you doing today, Alex?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on. How's everyone else going?
Yes, we've got Tim and Vance here. Say hello to Alex.
Hey, Vance.
Hey, Alex.
Hey.
In stereo. Well, wonderful.
Alex, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. Yeah. Well, thank you for letting me join in for the fun conversation.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we'll definitely get your insights in a minute. So Tim, in a nutshell, what would you say, as far as your research has shown you, how did Christianity begin? It obviously didn't begin with some people getting the Holy Spirit after the death of Christ, right?
Well, I think the traditional story is probably there probably is something to the traditional story, which is to say you've got this group of Jewish Christians in Judea who are being persecuted or otherwise mistreated by Romans and and other maybe Jewish authorities, and then you get Paul coming up with a completely seemingly different picture of what Christianity is. That seems to me there probably are some parallels between reality and that, but it seems to me to be a much more robust picture than that. I think that we have a story of Paul, which is to say a renegade Pharisee who's mistreating Jewish Christians, and he has Christ come to him in a revelation when he's in Damascus, and now all of a sudden he is he's a hardcore Christian. I don't really believe that. I think my sense is that Christianity, or some version of pre-Christianity, had been bubbling probably primarily throughout the diaspora between Egypt and Roman Asia, which is modern-day Turkey, probably for hundreds of years. We even have some groups, including who Epiphanius calls the Nazareans, who think that Jesus Christ lived around the time of Alexander Jannaeus, about 100 BC. That tradition seems to have filtered into a later polemical text called the Toldoth Yeshu, which has Jesus Christ living at a similar time. So I think throughout the time, people have particular ideas in their mind about who this Jesus guy was. The trouble is, I think that everybody or a lot of people anyway, have different people in mind.
But in essence, according to your blog, what we have is Jesus is really the paraclete. He is a spirit that descends upon people and possesses them and offers them insights. Is that basically what you think is the theory of Christianity?
I think that explains it pretty well. I think that is clearly the sentiment in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark completely omits any notion of the virgin birth. It also has Jesus's family after he starts behaving in this certain way. They want to lock him up, and that seems really, really in contrast with what a person who was born of a virgin would, something that you'd want to do with a person like that. So I think clearly what's happening here, and this is attested to in Irenaeus, who was one of the earliest anti-heresy advocates. It's clearly the case that Jesus gets baptized and maybe has some other underlying catalysts as well, and then the heavens open up and the Spirit descends onto him. And I think that sort of early version of adoptionism is probably something to the effect of the earliest version of Christianity.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head there. Adoptionism, the Spirit of Christ descends upon individuals and turns them into whatever, Christian bodhisattvas or something like that, and then it just spreads out from there.
Right, yeah, and I think clearly, if you look at some of the later traditions, particularly the Basilidian tradition, this Spirit doesn't stay in Jesus forever. It pops out evidently right before he dies, right as Simon of Cyrene is carrying his cross. So this sort of switcheroo, this tricking of the authorities, I think is a theme that carries through into all sorts of later traditions. I mean, something like that is going on in Islam as well, where there's an actual physical switch with Simon of Cyrene, evidently. There I think it's the Gospel of Judas. You've got Jesus tricking the authorities, except it's a little more of a celestial set of concerns in Judas. But I think it's clearly the motivation of the author and the underlying sect that this Spirit is transient. It is not permanent. It comes in after a certain set of catalysts, and it bounces out and goes to the next. And it may simply be that there is some choice that's going on in terms of the Most High God selecting a particular individual who's got the proper brand of spiritualism or whatever. But yeah, that seems to me to be what's going on in a nutshell.
Exactly. It reminds me of Stephen Davis's book, Spirit Possession and the Origins of Christianity. So I think, you definitely got something there. And what about you, Alex? I know you've said you're not a mythicist. What would you say are the origins of Christianity from what you've learned?
That's a really good question. So I have a sort of a theory that might kind of segues into Tim. So I kind of feel like it really does seem to originate with John the Baptist, especially when you look at the Clementine homilies. It just seems like that sort of tradition really flows from him. So because, he's considered like the original Messiah, and then Simon, of course, he's the one who actually continues on with the tradition. Now, I know Tim mentioned about the Paraclete. So it kind of seems like Jesus is also sort of a paraclete too. There's actually two paracletes.
Right. Yeah, I think that there are. Yeah, it's a pretty complex thing. I think what Mark gives us is a proto-paraclete, and of course, we get a more a firmer definition of what this paraclete is in the Gospel of John. Jesus says, "My Father will send a Spirit after me," and this Spirit, it seems to me, is originally represented in Mark as this spirit, as this Christ spirit that's bouncing out of Jesus and going into, in the case of Mark, Simon of Cyrene.
Oh yeah, and sometimes I do feel like a lot of the characters in the Bible, especially with Simon Peter and Paul, and even Jesus, I know it might offend a few people, but it feels like that they're like masks of like Jesus. John the Baptist, Simon, even Dositheos. It just seems like that's the way it is. I mean, and especially like with Theodos and Nathaniel. And it just seems like they're all the same character with Dositheus and Peter. They're just like, and there's also like different Simons too in the Bible, in the New Testament. There's like Simon the leper or Simon the zealot, Simon Magus. I feel like they're just like different roles assigned to different. I mean, you just feel like they're just different versions of the same Simon. I don't know.
Yeah, and obviously, I'm sure most of the listeners know that at least at some points throughout time, it's difficult to say whether it was the entire history of it. But Simon the magician, Simon Magus, who is in Acts of the Apostles and and described in other texts, was clearly a doppelganger for Paul. It's difficult to know whether that origin was, Paul and Simon Magus are the exact same person all the time. When you read Irenaeus on Simon, you get a picture that that contrasts in some ways with what we understand now to be Paul. But I think clearly the theme or the device that was being used is they would take attributes from one person and assign them to another, and this was to either sanitize a particular character or to polemicize them. I mean, this is even happening in Acts of the Apostles. If all you have to know about Cephas is what you have in Paul's letters, you don't get a very nice picture of Cephas, especially in their confrontation in Antioch in Galatians 2. Paul gets right up in Cephas's face and says, "You're a real jerk, essentially, for following, for listening to these men from James." In Acts of the Apostles, Peter hangs out with this Simon of Joppa, which is in Western Israel, on the coast of the Mediterranean, and this stay with Simon, who is a shoemaker or a tanner, it precedes a vision that Cephas has, or Peter has, where the Lord tells him that it's all okay now. And so, one wonders if this is just one more sanitization effort.
Yeah, it's real detective work, and sometimes I get dizzy. I mean, for example, Yuso and also Eisenman and Robert Price have shown that the Ebionites used to call Paul Simon, so it's right there. And then you show a story. There's a magician, Simon, who's doing magic spells for the procurator Felix. I mean, he's all over the place, isn't he? Right.
Well, and that Simon is a Cypriot. He's from Cyprus, and one gets to wonder what the heck is Felix doing contacting this Simon. And Josephus, who describes this story, doesn't really give a lot of insights into who this Simon or Adamus is, but he does say that he's a magician. And so it raises the question, why is Felix recruiting a Cypriot magician to convince a Herodian princess to marry him? I think modern reading or a modern interpretation is that, maybe this guy's a fast talker, he's a smooth talker, and he's really good at convincing people of things. Another idea is that he wanted Simon to make love potions, which when you read some of these early heresy hunters, they actually make explicit reference to these magical love potions. Marcus the magician, I think Carpocrates is mentioned in these terms. There's evidently a lot of early Christians who are using love potions, and so it's difficult to know if the Ebionites, who appear to be behind some of this anti-Simon writing, if they just looked at Josephus and pulled out a good villain and did this same thing where they took this shell of a Simon and they peppered him with attributes of a real person. It seems to me like that sort of thing is happening all the time.
And what do you have to say about that, Alex? Are we still all roads leading to Simon?
Yeah, I mean, so I've been doing research actually for my own book. So, and I feel like Christianity and Gnosticism actually comes from, or has an antecedent in ancient Judaism, especially in the First Temple tradition. And I think we discussed this a little bit, but it actually kind of goes back to Margaret Barker's thesis in that, the First Temple was basically revering wisdom, right? And then wisdom was expelled from the temple. And then the Second Temple was all about the law of Moses and Yahweh and all this kind of stuff. So it's like sort of like a turning back on wisdom, and Enoch and Jeremiah kind of goes into that. But it definitely does evolve with John and Simon for sure. It goes the next step because Simon's all about epinoia and Helena, and then I think that even like the Eastern Orthodox idea of the Theotokos is basically a continuation of like the Queen of Heaven worship. But anyway, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
That's what I wanted to ask next, and Tim, and then of course Alex, you can let us know your views, but definitely central to your blog and your research. And Alex sort of gave us a segue to the First Temple and the ancient Jewish times as the Queen of Heaven. Tell us about her importance back then and how she sort of flows into late Judaism and early Christianity.
Well, a lot of it is speculative, but we definitely know from 2 Kings and Jeremiah and other texts that Alex referenced that there was a Queen of Heaven. And in other words, we have a much more robust hierarchy in heaven than simply just the Most High and then some angels. This Queen of Heaven is evidently worshipped by a lot of people during the First Temple period, which is to say before the 7th century BCE. We get the temple destroyed. Well, let me back up for a second. There seems to be a compulsion in the few centuries leading up to the First Temple destruction among Jewish leaders to purge this queen from the temple. She evidently has a lot of representations and symbols associated with her. There are divine feminine figurines that have been excavated in archaeological searches in this area. But the major shift, I think, is during what scholars call the Deuteronomic Reform, where King Josiah, who is king in about 630 or so BC, he decides that he's going to purge this Queen of Heaven and implement a version of Judaism which is much more Moses-centric. And the catalyst for Josiah, at least according to the tradition, is that he had commanded some renovations on Solomon's temple, and his high priest Hilkiah found a long-lost book of the law, which is purported to be portions of Deuteronomy. And this, when you read Deuteronomy, it's very explicitly saying, knock it off with this idol worship, knock it off with these concerns about the heavens and the stars. And so we do get the purging of the queen's various things, including an Asherah pole or a fashioned tree, so to speak, which is could perhaps be the first temple version of the menorah, which is in the super secret holy room called the Holy of Holies. So the queen gets purged from the temple, and a couple decades later, Babylon invades, and within a few decades of this time, the temple is destroyed. And so we see in Jeremiah, there is pushback against this new orthodoxy, which omits the Queen of Heaven. You've got women saying, we're not going to stop burning incense and baking bread and pouring out wine for the Queen of Heaven, because when we stopped doing that, we were punished. Everything fell apart and our temple got destroyed. So it seems to me that this was a major concern for at least some Christians, and I think by extension, a real, maybe not antipathy, but a real divergence with this Moses-centric law and the Aaronic priesthood which followed.
Tim, I have a question. I discovered something amazing in the Old Testament, which is the Catholic version of the Bible. An older translation had reference to basically a character like the Queen of Wisdom. In the I think it's called in either the Book of Wisdom or the Wisdom of Solomon.
Right.
Do you think that's connected with this whole phenomenon? Because they basically edited out the references to wisdom as an actual female character and a very beneficent, almost, basically real spiritual presence into just, kind of a wisdom as a noun.
Yeah. Yes, I do. And I think that she is... Anytime you're talking about this feminine wisdom, which obviously clearly moves into the Greek world as Sophia, and probably has origins much older than that.
Right.
But I think what we can detect is that there was a major rewrite, a major scribal effort to omit the Queen of Heaven and to inject Moses. It's long been noticed that in Exodus 6, Moses says, yeah, that God who appeared to me also appeared to the patriarchs, to Abraham and Isaac. And so this little passage in Exodus 6:3, I think, alludes to a much broader insertion than simply trying to work out if Moses is seeing the same God as Abraham is. But I think that this is where a major shift in Judaism occurs. And this is nothing new that I'm saying here, but we get a real concerted move to a more monotheistic framework. And isn't it interesting that in a lot of these early Christian groups, it's anything but monotheistic? I mean, you don't even have the Most High creating the earth in most of these groups. So yes, I think that the more I look at it, the more evidence stacks up. It just seems to me that this desire to return to the Melchizedek priesthood, which is the priesthood which preceded the Aaronic, sort of Moses-centric priesthood, that was a real concern for Christians, and that's detectable in the book of Hebrews and other places throughout the New Testament. But yeah, I think what Christianity, especially Christians throughout the diaspora, were remembering was a more ancient form of Judaism, which had the Queen of Heaven.
What about you, Alex? I know you've also been doing a lot of research on the Queen of Heaven.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So when you look at the book of Revelation, it talks about, the woman clothed with the sun.
Mm-hmm.
And then she's also expelled, or like she's chased after by the great dragon of wrath, or the devil. It's really just symbolic of you have this the fall and redemption of Sophia. And actually, I actually found this out very recently. So Julius Africanus, he has like a book called About the Birth of Christ, but it kind of goes into all this stuff about Zeus and Sol Invictus and even Juno. So I kind of feel Astera, the wife or even the mother of Yahweh, is actually kind of connects to Juno. And Juno is, I think it's Hera, I believe, but she's like, the wife of Zeus. So it just has all these different allusions to Jove and Zeus. It's just like, wow, I can't believe it. No one's even talked about this text. It's pretty crazy. But going back to Melchizedek, he's the high priest, and then you do see him in many other traditions, not just in the Bible. You actually see him in the Pistis Sophia. He's the receiver, or the paralemptor, as the Pistis Sophia calls him. He basically receives the light particles that disperse throughout the universe and even in the Hades in hell. So he collects these light particles and he purifies them, and then takes them out of the clutches of the archons, or he fights the archons. So he's almost like, he even has a title that's very similar to Zoroaster. So he is. And he also reminds me of Mithras as well, because Mithras is sort of like this, fighting god or warrior god or warrior priest, and Melchizedek pretty much functions the same way. So it's just like, it's really amazing how many correspondences you can find between Melchizedek, Mithras, Zoroaster, and even Michael. Even you have Michael fighting Satan in Revelation 12. It's kind of the same idea. So I don't know. It's pretty crazy. The more I research this.
Yeah, no kidding. And I don't want you to give too much away from your new book. And what about Cybele? Does she tie into the Queen of Heaven motif?
Yeah. So Cybele, she's I believe the mother of Attis, and a lot of people connect Attis with Mithras as well. So Cybele is, funny enough, there's a guy named Montanus. He's a Orthodox priest, but of course he was basically rejected as a heretic later by the Orthodox councils. But he actually thought he was like the Paraclete too. And then he also had like two other women. I forgot their names, but basically what they were. He was saying that he's the Holy Ghost incarnate, and there's three different ages, and then he was also a priest of Cybele as well, because people I think it was Jerome thought he was actually the priest of Cybele, or the priest of Apollo, or something like that. So Cybele definitely does connect to the Virgin, because you have this idea of the virgin birth, and I've been doing a little bit more research on this, because the whole virgin birth motif really corresponds to this idea of parthenogenesis. And parthenogenesis is basically means that one female gives birth to another female. Apparently it's common in the animal kingdom. And I don't know if this ever happened to people, but apparently it has. I'm not sure. But the miracle of Jesus' birth was that he was a male. He was a male child. That a female actually gave birth to the male child without becoming, physically pregnant from a male seed. Yeah. So he's giving birth to actually a whole new human race of beings. He was like, so I kept thinking about this idea about the Gnostic race. Like, what does that mean? So it really goes back to Jesus. So I know, the Gnostics and the Orthodox hate each other, whatever, but they're really part of the same tribe. Even like a lot of early church fathers considered the Christians to be a tribe, or some sort of like the tribe of Israel. So, but going back to Cybele though, yes, Cybele is definitely important. So she's basically the mother of Attis, and Attis is like the almost like a eunuch, So you have this idea about Jesus. Jesus says that you're supposed to be, the eunuchs, forsake themselves so they could enter the kingdom of heaven. It kind of goes back to this idea of Cybele and Attis. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Wow, fascinating stuff. Yeah, all hail the Queen of Heaven. So
yeah.
Awesome.
Well, I'd like to mention just one more thing about Montanus. I think he's a pretty key player in this whole puzzle. He was said to have or at least his followers, were said to believe that they had founded the New Jerusalem, which was in central Turkey today, central Roman Asia today, in Phrygia, which is why it's sometimes called the Phrygian heresy. And this notion of the New Jerusalem is really detectable in Revelation, at towards the end of Revelation, as the woman comes down from heaven as a bride adorned for her bridegroom. And this woman, I think, is the restoration of the woman from Revelation 12, who stood in, the woman clothed in the sun. And so she, throughout the latter half of Revelation, you've got this major contrast between this woman who's knocked out of heaven and pursued by this dragon, and she is replaced on earth by the whore of Babylon, who comes riding in on this same red seven-headed dragon. And I think that what we have here is Revelation's authors contrasting the first and the second temple. So the whore of Babylon is more or less the second temple, and I kind of developed that idea throughout my blog. But in terms of Montanus, clearly I think any reference to this notion of the New Jerusalem, which I think would have been springing up, especially after the Bar Kokhba revolt, where Jews are eventually expelled out of Judea, that would have been a major concern. But it's interesting that you've got this correlation between the Montanists and Revelation. I think it's probably pretty clear that they did use Revelation, as did a lot of groups. I actually have argued that I think Revelation, at least portions of it, excluding a bunch of 1 through 3, it might be some of the earliest Christian literature.
Fascinating. And, well, why don't we continue unpacking the origins of Christianity? Again, it's detective work. And obviously the earliest Christian writings traditionally are Paul, and Paul is considered a central figure. And even recently in the Inner Sanctum of Gnosis group, I put up an article, Everything You Know About the Gospel of Paul is Likely Wrong. And I think it's so true. Most of us grew up and we read into Paul about hell and original sin and faith and all that good stuff. But when you put Paul in the context of his times, really his central message was the overthrow of the archons by the Aeon Jesus. And you had some great input on it too, Tim. Tell us about that and about Paul himself.
Well, I think, to the extent that we can pull out the authentic Paul, which is sort of a challenge in itself, considering that half of the Paul letters in the New Testament appear to be at least partial forgery. When you start to look at what appears to be the authentic Paul, the Greek words don't really line up very much at all with what modern translations give for them. One of the, I think, more egregious examples of this is in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul is saying Christ appeared to Cephas and then to the 12 and the 500 and to James, and then as the last disciple or apostle, I can't remember which terminology Paul uses, he appears to me as to one born, it's often translated as out of time. But what the term he uses is ectroma, which is a miscarriage. And that, when you read various Gnostic texts, such as on the origins of the earth, we have Adam being created without a soul. And he's just laying there lifeless, as though he's born of an abortion. And Sophia delivers his soul to him. And so what I think this strikes me as incredibly correlated to this notion of this early adoptionism, this notion that a spirit is descending on basically an empty vessel, and that because he received the Spirit, he's now a slave to it. He's doing things like Jesus in Mark. he wouldn't have normally done. And I think that to me, it is, it makes the case, I think, that Mark's author had Paul in mind as he's writing what this Christ spirit is doing. But two, I think that it taps into a much bigger Gnostic, a collection of Gnostic sensibilities that are really glossed over by translators in particular, but probably later redactors as well.
So when, for example, you mentioned this in the Gospel of Thomas, when Jesus says, when you see one who is not born of a woman, prostrate yourselves on your faces and worship him. That one is your father. Is this basically somebody like Paul? He's becoming the primal Adam. He's reborn with this new spirit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus also says, follow James, because it was on his account that the heavens and the earth were created. So what the Gospel of Thomas is saying, assuming that those two sayings were written by the same author, is you have a leader now, but be on the lookout for someone. and that person to be on the lookout for is someone who's born of abnormal circumstances. So it's interesting that a lot of the early heretics that Irenaeus and others write about, they say Christ is reborn all the time. He's reborn in subsequent generations all the time, undergoing different circumstances surrounding their birth. So in some cases it's a normal birth, and in some cases there's a little bit more oddity involved.
But what about the idea of Jesus being crucified by demons in outer space, as some mythicists like Richard Carrier say? What do you think about that idea?
It could be. I really struggle with that. I think that the closest parallel we have to anything like that comes from Hippolytus and Epiphanius when they talk about a heretic named Elchasai. And Elchasai has twin spirits in the sky. They're 96 miles tall. There's a male and a female. And we learn from Epiphanius that Elchasai had a collection of followers, including Ebionites, who have this adoptionistic framework. So to the extent that you can draw a link between these two things, it would seem to stand to reason that these spirits in the sky are sort of like spiritual beacons broadcasting signals of themselves onto the
I love that. It's so badass.
Yeah. So I think it's really a shame that we don't get a lot more insight into Elchasai, because I sort of suspect that he was a key player in all this and that he's been glossed over. One of the stories about Elchasai is that he's got a revelatory text which has wars erupting in heaven and angels fighting on different sides of the thing. And to me, I almost wonder if that's not revelation or some proto version of it, or perhaps something that was used in conjunction with it in some sects.
And what about you, Alex? What is your take on Paul, the myth maker?
Oh yeah, so if you read 1 Corinthians, he does talk about how the gods or the lords of this aeon, crucified the Lord of glory, right? So it really does seem like it's sort of a Gnostic idea. It's kind of hard to separate, especially when you read it in Greek, that, he does use terms like archons and aeons and Sophia and logos. It's all over the place. So, the idea that Paul was not a Gnostic, he was fighting Gnosticism, is actually kind of a joke to me,
Right. Right. And so, and we do get a rewrite of Paul essentially in the pastorals, notably, where they're where they've got Paul saying all kinds of things that are against what would have certainly been groups who revered him. So, yeah, I definitely agree with you on that.
Oh yeah, and then even you mentioned that Elchasai had a Book of Revelation, or his own version of Book of Revelation. I think he was saying that there is actually a giant serpent in the north that watches everything, and that there's actually like angels fighting each other in the northern stars. It kind of connects to the idea, how that Lucifer said that he would raise himself to the above the Most High to the northern stars. So it just, I mean, I keep finding this idea about the north, like the northern stars is where the heavens are apparently. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Paul. If you read, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, I think Robert Price does mention that 2 Corinthians is more of a Marcionite text because talks about the Lord, this aeon, or the God of this world. And Ion, like Ion is a very interesting term, right? Like Ion is, of course, the Mithraic god, the lion-headed god of who holds the keys of time, and it also reminds me of Saint Peter, who also holds the keys of the kingdom. So like Janus, they're all kind of like the same pagan deities. It's really interesting, especially when you research Catholicism, how many correspondences it has with pagan religion, especially with Mithraism. But anyway, yeah, just an interesting thought.
And what would you say, Alex? As you argue, Christianity began with John the Baptist, might have been the fountainhead, and spread out with Simon and so forth. So who would Paul be? Do you still think Paul might be Simon? Again, this broken up character?
Yeah, I still think that's the case, but just look like it. I kind of go back and forth. I do feel like, yes, he has a lot of correspondences with Simon, but at the same time, he does have a Jewish, flavor to him as well. Even though he does, talk against the law, Christ came to crucify the law in Romans 5 or Galatians, but I think the Jewish flavor can be explained with the Samaritan background of Simon.
Right.
So, and of course, you have Simon. He's considered like the Taheb, maybe in the Samaritan religions. The Taheb is the Samaritan Messiah. So I think John, was also a Taheb. So he's like, the idea of like apostolic succession, I think, also comes from the Simonian idea of passing the Spirit on, right, to each successive generation. Then you see John with Simon, and then Dositheus, and then Simon passes on the Spirit to Menander, and so on and so forth. It's kind of goes with the idea of the Gnostic race or the priesthood, Melchizedek. So anyway, I think it's all connected.
Yeah, and one of the things that Margaret Barker points out is, if you read Galatians 1, Paul is saying he received his revelation, and then where did he go? Like if he was really, concerned about Orthodox Judaism, one would expect that he would go to Jerusalem, but he didn't. He went to Arabia. Right. And so one of the points Margaret Barker makes is that that's where the holy priesthood went. That's where the priests of the Melchizedek priesthood went during the Babylonian invasion. And so the speculation here is that the Arabian priests that Paul interacted with were descendants of these earlier Melchizedek priests.
Oh wow, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing. Moving on to the Gospel of Mark. You deal a lot with the Gospel of Mark in your work. Tim, tell us about the Gnostic origins and perhaps the authorship as far as you can tell.
Well, it's tricky. There's clearly magic going on in Mark. Matthew is explicitly omitting things from Mark. He's admitting curing the deaf and mute with saliva. But one of the things that I think is happening, and I alluded to it earlier, is that Mark is leading up. The big finale of Mark isn't that Jesus gets crucified, although that's sort of the final act. But the big point of the whole thing was to show the transient spirit and that it was going to Simon of Cyrene. And the reason why I think that Simon of Cyrene is essentially a cipher for Paul is because of what hostility that the Gospel of Matthew treats him with. when Jesus is saying the last shall be first, John comes running and saying, "Hey, there's a guy casting out demons in your name," and Mark had just gotten done telling his readers that you can't cast out demons without Jesus' authority, or more specifically, the apostles received Jesus' authority to cast out demons. So who is this mysterious figure? And I think that what seems quite obvious to me is that this is a reference to Paul, but more to the point, it's a reference to Simon of Cyrene. But I think there's, the fact that who is using the Gospel of Mark is really telling here. The fact that you've got the Basilidians using the Gospel of Mark seems very strange, because when you read about the Basilidians, they have a really, really Gnostic view. I mean, they've got Sophia and the nous and the logos and all these things that you would typically find to be characteristic of Gnostic beliefs. And yet they're using this Gospel of Mark, which seemingly talks about this ordinary guy who's receiving the Spirit. And so what I think is probably happening here is that the Gospel of Mark is simply an allegory for perhaps more celestial concerns and concerns like that. But that there's a lot of things kind of hiding in the Gospel of Mark or things that are in the Gospel of Mark that are removed in Matthew. And I think anytime that happens, you've got to be on the lookout, because Matthew appears to be used by a group of more Judaized Christians. And so they're going to be hostile to not only Gnosticism and magic, but also specifically to Paul. And so anytime that Matthew seems to disagree with Mark, it seems like a likely case where they're rejecting some of these earlier ideas.
And backing up a bit, and I forgot to ask this, but it sort of ties in, you also equate Paul with the Egyptian. Could you tell the audience about this, Tim?
Yeah, so if you read Josephus, he talks about this Egyptian who comes to Judea sometime evidently in the early 50s, although he might have been coming earlier than that. And he gets a lot of people riled up. and the procurator at the time has to put down what appears to be either a rebellion or some kind of collection of undesirable behavior, at least for the Roman authorities. It's interesting that in Acts of the Apostles, when Paul gets arrested, the Roman says, "Hey, aren't you the Egyptian?" and so you get to wonder, and so you get to wonder what's going on here. I think you have to read Acts carefully, because clearly they've got an agenda. There's probably multiple authors written over some number of years, and some of these sentiments are either anti-Paul or at the very least are seeking some sort of synthesis between Pauline and Petrine and Jamesian Christianity. So the question of why I think that it sort of hooks up to another writer as well, Clement of Alexandria. There's a very important passage that Clement of Alexandria gives, and it's a paragraph, and he's talking about all these heretics. He's talking about Marcion and Valentinus and Peter and Simon, and he says that this Theodos is a student of Paul, and through the mystery that Paul taught him, he teaches Valentinus. I actually think that that Clement got some chronology wrong here, and my support for that is that he gets some other chronology wrong in the paragraph. He says that Marcion precedes Simon and Peter, and Paul, which that doesn't seem to be the case. It's hard to make the case that Marcion is in the early 1st century, presumably, is what Clement is saying there. But what I think is that this Theodos, about whom Clement speaks, is the same Theodos who is described by Josephus in sort of this similar line as the Egyptian, where you've got these sort of spiritual leaders who are causing some kind of trouble for the Romans. And so what I think is going on here is that Theodos teaches Paul, who teaches Valentinus. And it gets a little bit drawn out here. I kind of feel like it's going on here, but but what's so interesting about Theodos is that he looks a lot like John the Baptist. He's bringing his followers down to the Jordan River. He's claiming he can part the river. He's telling them to bring all their possessions, similar to Jesus saying, "Sell all your possessions." He upsets the procurator. The procurator sends out a band of troops to kill him. They behead him, and they parade his head around Jerusalem. Wow. And this to me looks a lot like John the Baptist. I mean, it's really looks like it in consequential ways here. And if you look at the chronology that Josephus describes, this Theodos dies around the year 42 to 44. It's difficult to know exactly what year. And it's less than 10 years later that this Egyptian is causing a stir. And so if you look at the parallels between this story and tradition, where you presume that the Egyptian is following Theodos, it looks an awful lot like Jesus is following John the Baptist. And so, again, going back to Mark seems to be particularly concerned that Paul is the new paraclete. He's the new Jesus Christ on earth. And so what I think might be hiding in here, and that Acts is sort of trying to detract from, is that some of these early Christians saw Paul as Jesus Christ on earth, and that he received his spirit from, or via baptism from, this John the Baptist type of character.
The plot just thickens, man. And what about you, Alex? Anything on the Gospel of Mark or Basilides or Basilides or anything about this?
Oh, yeah. Well, when you look at, there's different Gnostic texts. There's the second, I think it's a declaration of Seth or something like that. But it does talk about, how Jesus descended to the distant spheres of the archons and how, he's sort of like shape-shifted. But it does have this one passage where it says that, Jesus tricked the archons into thinking that they crucified him when really it was Simon of Cyrene. So, I think it's Irenaeus who talks about this, but he says that, Simon of Cyrene and this, switcheroo idea that Jesus does with Simon is really more of a Basilidian idea. Now, Basilides was also an Egyptian Gnostic, and I mean, it's amazing how many correspondences you can connect with, with Egyptian theology and Gnosticism, even with Ptah, right? Ptah was like almost like a demiurge, but also like a mystery god as well. So he also had his own cross, right? Have the cross of the fertility. Right. It does sort of influence, later Christianity and Gnosticism for sure. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Gospel of Mark definitely has a lot of Gnostic ideas involved in it. I mean, you do have this idea of the wilderness, and I think you pointed this out, Tim, that the wilderness is sort of like this other astral dimension, sort of. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out like a better term for it, but it just seems like that's what all these different Bible texts are talking about. You know, how Jesus went to the wilderness, or you know, Sophia, or the woman clothed with the sun is actually cast out into the wilderness. But anyway, what do you think about that?
Well, you know, it really is interesting that he goes out to the wilderness for 40 days. I think that's the thing. You know, one of the things that was common in these early texts is that a day would equal a year or 100 years or 1,000 years. And so it really kind of is interesting that Jesus's birth coincides with roughly the 4,000th year after creation, and in the Jewish time frame. So, I think that I think that sort of that leads into the Gospel of John. You know, like Jesus is the Logos in John, and through him all things are created. You know, I wonder if there is some correlation between that and Jesus being attended to by the angels for these 40 days. That seems to me, I kind of run out of steam when I'm trying to argue that, but that seems pretty likely to me, especially considering, you know, like you said, that there are a lot of links, it would appear, between Markan traditions and Alexandria, and this would be this would line up pretty well with some of the other things that were going on in Alexandria.
Yeah, what do you think about the Gospel of Mark as far as like the chronology? Do you think it's an earlier text or later text? I mean, what's your opinion?
Well, I think I'm forced to presume. I mean, I think clearly Matthew is reworking Mark. You know, in some cases, Matthew is fixing some errors that Mark makes, or he sort of blunders. He doesn't seem particularly knowledgeable about the geography or culture or customs around Judaism, or in around Jerusalem and that area. So, you know, I think that a lot of people have made the case that Luke might have been first, or some kind of proto-Luke. And so one wonders, you know, is that the gospel that Marcion was evidently using? You know, people say Marcion used the Gospel of Luke, or some corrupted version of it. You take the virgin birth out of Luke, it's Mark. And so I've sort of wondered if the gospel that people attribute to Marcion is actually Mark. But I think I'm sort of forced to presume that Mark is earliest, although I think John probably includes some of the earlier traditions, especially around the mother. The mother plays very importantly, at least in my opinion, in the Gospel of John.
I think that's all the time we have today. For the audience, I'm sure Alex and Tim and Vance and myself will continue this discussion in our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis group, because, again, there's so much to unpack. But please visit Tim's blog, timsteppingout.com, and certainly visit Alex's blog, theaeoni.com, because there's so much more than what we've discussed. We've only scratched the surface. But thank you very much for joining us, Tim.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
And thank you for being, Alex. I enjoyed having you on, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd be down to be on again for sure.
Awesome. Yes. And again, thanks for being here, Vance.
Oh, it's as usual, my pleasure. And it's been fascinating, gentlemen. You guys are very informative and interesting.
Thanks.
And there you have it. The first part of an electric interview with both Tim Claason and Alex Rivera. The second part is just as intense and liberating. More than 40 minutes of cold gnosis. In our second part, we go deep into the Gnostic sage Basilides and Egyptian magic. We further mine the Gospel of Mark for a Gnostic foundation, as well as get penetrating revelations on, yes, the Book of Revelation. Queen of Heaven / Sophia, do you have to let it linger? We cover the theologies of the enigmatic Cerinthus and Valentinus, including an overlooked notion that Jesus and Satan were brothers, part of that Cain and Abel archetypal narrative. Tim and Alex speculate on why the Gnostics failed and orthodoxy won the day, as well as the dating of the canonical Gospels, and much, much more, including Tim weighing in on the Robert Price-Bart Ehrman debate. Only $5.99 a month to join, complete and on partial shows, access to more than 380 episodes with the best and brightest in Gnosticism, Western esoterica, and free thought. Your own private RSS feed where you can listen to all complete shows on the podcatcher of your choice. And for patrons, we now have an exclusive one for you. You'll get invitation to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where we will continue our discussion with Tim and Alex, and you can ask them questions personally if you want. Many past guests hang out there, like Robert Price, Tim Freak, Andrew Phillips Smith, Steve D., Robert Sullivan, and more. And I'm always there to directly and personally answer your questions and issues, and give you news on the show before it happens. Same benefits if you become a patron at Patreon, except you get early shows. If anything, a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail really helps. Let's keep this independent media going in a world that doesn't want you to go to the past and see the crimes that need to be solved and trauma that needs to be healed. I truly appreciate the help of many on my team, like Luthien, Moondog, Marvelin, and DJ Atwood, whose tune you heard right at the beginning of the show. And he also provides most awesome movie clips like the Life of Pi one you heard at the beginning. Again, the Messiah is just your imagination being released from the crosses of the average. You are the logos and you rock. And are you still wearing that stupid man suit? Yes, that's from Donnie Darko, another logos, in case you wanted to know. Hello and goodbye as always.